Hello, everybody, and thanks for joining us for week 2 of the Best of the West book club. We are working through chapters 4 to 6 of Havel's Power of the Powerless, and we'll begin with a brief recap of who we are and why we're doing this. Dr. Robillard, what brings you here?
What brings me here is I've found myself, like yourself, as a academic dissident, much in the way similar to the spirit of Havel. And we're doing our best in the margins of the institutions to resurrect some of the best ideas of the West. And Havel is a great exemplar of what that looks like.
Well, I'm grateful you're here. You left, I was
Likewise.
fired, but we've both got a lot of common ground. Now,
Yes,
let's
certainly.
begin, as last week, with our prayer from St. Thomas Aquinas, the student's prayer to set the tone. Could you lead us, please?
Yes. Come, Holy Spirit, divine creator, true source of light and fountain of wisdom. Pour forth your brilliance upon my dense intellect. Dissipate the darkness which covers me, that of sin and of ignorance. Grant me a penetrating mind to understand, a retentive memory, method and ease in learning, the lucidity to comprehend, and abundant grace in expressing myself. Guide the beginning of my work, direct its progress, and bring it to successful completion. This I ask through Jesus Christ, true God and true man, living and reigning with you and the Father forever and ever. Amen.
Amen. Beautiful prayer. I love that.
Yes.
Now, recapping on last week, then, we've agreed that we think there are 4 main points to take away from Havel's concept of a post totalitarian dictatorship. First one is that we have a choice between ideology and integrity. And what I take him to mean by this is that ideology is like a lure that gives us an easy answer. He describes it as fanaticism. So it comes at the cost of our own integrity, but yet it gives us easy answers. It seems like a straightforward solution to some of the deepest existential problems, and it doesn't really demand any sacrifice to us. So it's like a surrogate religion, but one without the
Hmm.
cross. That's the way I think of it. Would you agree?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I would say so. Yeah. It has a an ease in which it orients one's entire worldview, and it doesn't doesn't really allow for much self reflection or coming to one's own conclusions.
And he thinks that in the modern world, we're particularly susceptible to ideology for one main reason, which there's a kind of grayness or emptiness to it. Having been drained of meaning, value, and purpose by the scientism conception of human life and the world. So things only count when they can be quantified and understood in mathematical terms. Human beings, because they aren't built for that, long for something more. And ideology at least purports to provide that.
Hmm.
Now, what about this manipulatory network then? That was another one of the concepts from last week. That's how the post totalitarian dictatorship of bureaucracy differs from the classical dictatorship. What did you understand by the manipulatory network?
Right. This is the one of the key distinctions Havel points out is what makes the totalitarian post totalitarian bureaucracy different than the classical dictatorship, and he points to all the ways in which this network is diffuse. There's not a recognizable oligarch. There's not some regime that stages a coup and publicly overtakes the head of the state. Rather, it's this diffuse network of all these little nudges that, in totality, end up trapping people and degrading them and rendering them into automatons. But it's not identifiable in the way that you would see a classic, like a Saddam Hussein taking over Iraq kind of coup.
Yeah, exactly. And in many ways, that makes it more formidable, more insidious, because
Hmm.
you can't pinpoint it. For people who missed last week, here's a quick rundown of the 6 characteristics of the classical dictatorship according to Havel. It's a small group that wields open power. It's socially distinct. It also has localized power. It mainly focuses on armed might, and it fears a similar group. And by his reasoning, the dictatorship of political bureaucracy is not defined by these six characteristics. Instead, it functions as a network and focuses on manipulation of the day to day existence of its citizens. Now, people don't really like to be manipulated. So, how come it works? Tell us about the greengrocer's sign. What does it mean for him to be asked to put a sign up, and why does he do it, according to Havel?
So Howell has this great example of the greengrocer who puts out his onions, puts out his vegetables, and he puts up the sign "Workers of the World Unite," and he does so automatically because that's what all the other people in the shops are doing, and that whether he acknowledges it or not, that is the price of admission for living in society and existing in society, and essentially saying I'm not going to cause any problems, right? This is a soft way of socially signaling I'm not going to. I know my place. I know my place. I know my role within the social pecking order, and I don't want to be molested by the powers that be and anybody who would see me as a problem. However, what Howell points out is if the sign said something like I submit, I acquiesce to whatever the power structure is, that would it would be too overt. So what the sign does, it hides the low foundations of the power structure, and it lets him save face and socially signal that he is being appeasing without while still giving plausible deniability to it.
Yeah, very well put. So, the degradation involved in submission to the system is disguised behind the facade of something more palatable, something appealing.
Hmm. Hmm.
Okay. Well, I think we've covered what we wanted to from the first lesson. So let's keep these concepts in the background and work our way through the next sections.
Sounds good.
All right. Now, the first concept we want to look at is this idea of mutual service, which is that, as Havel puts it, political bureaucracy serves people only to the extent necessary to ensure that people will serve it. Anything which leads people to overstep their predetermined roles is regarded by the system as an attack upon itself. This is very different from the traditional conception of a ruler as acting in the interests of the people. So the city in the Aristotomist conception of man and the state exists for man as a way of perfecting man, because a human as an individual has an eternal destiny, but the city doesn't. This
Hmm.
turns that on its head. So we just exist to serve the system. But who decides the predetermined roles? What did you understand by that idea?
Well, I liked his notion of what he refers to as blind automatism, and how a lot of this ends up being almost emergent and self reinforcing, so that you do have uh, people that are benefiting from it, but as he goes on later to point out, that they're equally as trapped within it as well. So you end up with a kind of blind self-reinforcing system where everybody's policing one another, and there's very little escape, even at the upper echelons of the hierarchy, which is, as you say, this is a total inversion of how the state ought to relate to the individual in a benevolent, just society.
Yeah, and the main thing that predetermines the nature of the role is submission to the ideology, because, as Havel has pointed out, the main threat to it is truth. So
Mhm.
the only one way to interact with it is to be complicit in its lies. And I guess the attack it fears is the greengrocer who won't put the sign up, which is a metaphor for one person saying no.
Yes, yes, and the tipping point that would generate, if we have too many greengrocers actually speaking the truth, then that disrupts the entirety of the this edifice of lies and and soft power nudges.
Yeah. Now, the concept of what power is permitted, then, he says individuals are allowed power. An individual's
Mhm.
desire for power is admissible only insofar as its direction coincides with the direction
Yes.
of the
Yeah.
automatism of the system. Now,
Mhm.
this is a point you just made. What do we mean by automatism here? It's an interesting concept.
Well, I think we can think of it in terms of automatic car or self-regulating car, whereas this is it's just going to be you're operating as an instrument or as a part of an instrument within this larger machine, and that is your value. Your value is the degree to which you function as an instrument within this larger mechanism. But any notion of personal dignity or personal worth is not part of that equation. It's you're useful only insofar as you're an instrument within the mechanism.
Sure. And taking your analogy of the car, it does it does your thinking for you. So
Mhm, mhm.
automatic in the sense that everything is self-regulated and your part to play is already determined. The point at which you change gears, as it were,
Mhm.
what your next thought is going to be. There's only one groove you can run in.
Yes, yeah, and I mean, I'm sure there's many instances that we see of that today as well, where there's this entire suite of beliefs that coalesce together, where you're supposed to believe this thing and signal this thing, and once you're off to the races on that, then this entire set of claims and propositions, it's just assumed that now you say this, now you endorse this candidate, now you endorse this policy, and it's that this entire package of pre-planned programs, I guess, comes along with that.
Yeah, well, they talk about intersectionality, don't they? And that's a kind of conceptual intersectionality.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, definitely.
Now, the other point Havel makes is that this system is a world of appearances trying to pass for reality. If I just remove our cameras and give people a clearer image of Plato's cave, because this is what it reminded me of most
Hmm.
of all. So, what we've got with the cave here is that the prisoners are chained on the left hand side there, facing the wall, and they see the shadows cast by the puppets that the people on the other side of the wall are holding up. And it's the fire that is providing the light for that. They mistake those shadows for reality. And if somebody manages to escape from the cave and look at the sun and the real objects outside, and then comes back to the cave and tries to explain to the prisoners, Plato says that the prisoners believe this man is insane. They regard him as a threat. They even try
Hmm.
to kill him. So, this idea that ideology is about appearances passing for reality, I think, is a variation on Plato's allegory of the cave. Now, in what way do you think this can help us to understand the situation today?
Well, I think the if anything, Havel points to the idea of truth being the way out of the cave, or the way out of the ideological post totalitarian system, and Plato argues the same. So one needs to consider what are the elements or aspects of truth by which one can navigate. And if anything, if one starts considering just the internal coherence of the present regime, you mentioned intersectionality and how on their by their own terms, on their by their own propositions, how we end up in an incoherent nest of contradiction upon contradiction upon falsehood and false, where it's evident to anybody who can reason. That I think at least provides now an opportunity to say, well, if this set of contradictions, this is clearly false, this is clearly not correct. Now that gives at least some crack in the lattice work to begin looking through and say, well, truth has to be somewhere away from that. And Havel argues that we need to not live within lies, and I think he echoes the same sentiment.
I think that's a sensible point to make about it. My only worry would be that if we're looking for internal incoherence, I think you can find it, certainly, but it's also possible for a system to be internally coherent, consistent, and yet
Mm-hmm.
still totally detached from reality.
Yes. Yeah.
So that alone wouldn't necessarily be enough.
Exactly. Right. Yeah.
The
The
shadows can all
schizoph.
make
Yeah.
sense with each other.
Yes. Yep. True. True. So yeah, I think you need something outside of that. You need foundationalism. You need ground truth.
Yeah.
One might say God, and but even prior to that, I think the stepping stone towards that might be just an observation of the internal inconsistencies of the present regime itself. That's at least a midway step to saying, well, maybe there's even on its own terms, this is breaking up. So
Yeah,
I have to jump to something else.
exactly. And for many people, that has been transgenderism. I think that's the point
Mhm,
at
mhm.
which they've said this doesn't match reality.
It doesn't match reality personally or collectively. We've made some type of error somewhere. So there needs to be a backing up. There needs to be a reassessment of starting principles, foundations, what we assume to be right, true, beautiful, etc. And yeah, that begins the that begins I think a huge undertaking of figuring out where the error went.
Yeah, and who these people holding up the puppets are.
Yeah, yeah, that too. Yep, yep, yeah.
All right, now the next really fascinating concept is gloved power. The post totalitarian system touches people at every step, but it does so with its ideological gloves on. Now, this to me sounds similar to when Havel talks about degradation and disguise. What examples can we think of being touched with ideological gloves?
I think this takes the form most often in linguistic nudges, and you can think of pronouns in emails. You can think of non-propositional things like rainbow flags.
Mm.
You can think of uh, c- concepts of racial bias and whatnot that are already importing an entire set of metaphysical and ethical and epistemological commitments prior to that that training even beginning. It's the equivalent of going up to somebody and say, have you stopped beating your wife yet? Yes or no? It's like, well, wait a second. Well, like that's presupposing an entire set of things, right? Like maybe the person doesn't even have a wife, right? So the presuppositions of a lot of the present woke nudging are part of what I think is baked into, or it's baked into the ideological nudging that we're talking about. It's
Yeah,
not
the
overt.
the other idea this reminds me of is the proverb that the last thing the fish sees is the water. You don't
Yes. Yeah.
realize what you're
Yeah.
swimming in. And you see this often in people talking about, well, what do you want as a post-liberal alternative? Some kind of theocracy. And they are assuming there that liberalism isn't already a kind of theocracy, just with a
Mhm.
different God.
Right. Yes.
Because if we
Exactly.
take Hubbles'
Exactly. Yep.
idea of the surrogate religion, then
Hmm.
that's ultimately what it is. It's his own system of worship. So you're being um, prevented from realizing that, prevented from noticing it by the gloves, always being touched with the gloves on. Whereas if you
Hmm.
dig
Hmm.
down to what the naked hand behind really is, you'll see it is demanding worship.
Yes. The other element of the gloves, I think, are they represent the soft power edges of the Overton window. And when you go over that, then the hard power comes out. Then you're either it's the state from above or it's Antifa at your door from below. But
Yeah,
either of those things are the soft power nudges prior to that is within that is the Overton window.
yeah, exactly. Well, that's why they always have the clenched fist as a symbol, isn't it? Like
Right.
it's
Yeah.
telling you, like this is what's
Yep.
behind the glove.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Certainly.
it's easy to forget that because the gloved hand appears limp wristed and manicured, because that's the whole image of it.
It's the tolerant, open-minded left until they're not.
That's it, exactly.
Yeah.
Now, the problem here, though, is that ultimately the regime is captive to its own lies. It must falsify everything. It falsifies
Hmm.
the past, it falsifies the present, and it falsifies the future. It falsifies statistics. Now, how can the regime be captive to its own lies? We know that the truth will set you free. So I guess it makes sense along those terms that every deviation from the truth is going to be a kind of slavery. But it sounds like it gets trapped in its own manipulatory network.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it does because once you divert from truth, there needs to be an adjustment, and then there needs to be another adjustment. So you can imagine this almost misshapen foundation or misshapen house where you keep adding on, additional lattice work until it's completely misshapen, and your only adjustments. If you're going to refuse to go back and fix the foundations, then the only thing left is to keep adding on more and more bizarre uh, adjustments and ad hoc revisions.
Yeah, and that means there's a kind of fragility to it as well, and
Hmm.
also
Hmm.
a paranoia, which is behind, for example, Solzhenitsyn's exile from the Soviet Union. It also reminds me a bit of the plot of Macbeth. Say, if you just kill the king, then you'll be safe. You'll be on the throne. But the second he's done that, he realizes there's someone else to kill. And his
Hmm.
whole
Hmm.
life becomes about the defense of what he's acquired illicitly.
Right, right, right.
Similar idea here. Once the lie starts,
Yes.
it snowballs.
Yep. Yep.
But
And
the
then on mass that ends up creating, yeah, a self-reinforcing
yeah,
totalitarian space. Yeah.
that's it. And returning to the idea of the facade, alongside being captive to its own lies, we've got the pretense that it's not doing what it's doing. It pretends not to possess an omnipotent and
Mm.
unpredictable police apparatus. It
Yes.
pretends to respect human rights. It pretends to persecute no one. It pretends to fear nothing. It pretends to pretend nothing.
Hmm.
Now, this
Hmm.
is all part of the illusion, isn't it? So, technically, we still have free speech.
Right.
It
Yeah.
just gets
Yeah.
defined in such a way that only what the regime says counts as free speech.
Yeah. Pretty much. Pretty much. I what comes to mind is what is it, the third Batman, where or maybe where Bane grabs a guy by the shoulder and goes, do you feel in charge? And I feel like that's the almost what I'd want to say to a lot of folks in a lot of these positions that have drunk in the Kool-Aid and believe themselves to be oppressors because the regime keeps just hammering over the head with that idea. It's like, if you are the oppressed, do you really feel in charge? Because it certainly doesn't look that way.
Yeah, it's a good image to use to think about that because the straight white male oppressor narrative, that's the opposite of what most of those guys feel in day to day life, isn't it? They feel the
Yeah,
opposite of in charge.
yeah, yeah. If one were really the oppressor, then they wouldn't. I guess I'm losing this thought here.
If they were really the oppressor, then that should be clear to them somehow in their
It should
interaction
be, yeah,
with other
it
people.
should be naked power, yeah, at least,
Now,
one would
the
think.
the problem with the lie, the reason it derives its strength from individuals, is that ultimately they don't have to accept it. You don't have to personally affirm it. It is enough for them to have accepted their life with it and in
Mm,
it. This is
mhm.
a key distinction. For by
Yes.
this very fact, individuals confirm the system, fulfill the system, make the system, are the system. And this is a sensible point because ultimately, society is an abstraction and it has no concrete existence apart from the individuals that comprise it. So Havel is very sensibly saying here that what is this system we're talking about? Ultimately, it's anybody who is conforming to it. But why don't you have to accept the lie? How come it's enough just to live with it?
I think the behavior ends up being the very same. So if I'm complicit with a particular system, or if I'm a true believer, but I still end up doing the same action, then at the end of the day, we're both still causally contributing and reinforcing that same system, even though internally it might be a different set of intentional states. Uh, it's the behavior is still very much the same. On this point, I think I kind of disagree with Havel to the extent that if one does this long enough, I think they will in fact retroactively convince themselves that they actually did always believe the lie that they were within. So I think over a long enough time, I think people get ground down where they actually they forfeit that internal space as well.
It takes a piece of you, doesn't it? And I think that that lie within the soul, which is what Plato
Hmm.
says we should fear most of all, ultimately is corrosive. And you lose your integrity in acting along with it. So the
Hmm.
more you bow, the more you abase yourself,
Right.
the
Right.
harder it becomes to ever stand up.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. It's not there. There's no like neutral in any of this. It's either you're reinforcing one muscle movement or the other, right? You're either getting stronger in complicity or stronger in resistance. But I really don't think there's much neutral space.
Yeah, we've got a point just coming on the chat saying that arguably acting as if something is true is the same as believing it is true.
Hmm.
And
Hmm. Right.
pragmatically, certainly that's
Yeah.
the case. And the
Yeah.
main thing here that Havel would say is that um, it contributes to the illusion and does the job of seducing more people to believe it. Let's say
Hmm.
with COVID, for example, you might not have believed that masks do anything, but by wearing one and being complicit in that, you are presenting to anybody else nearby that you think they work and they don't know that you don't think they do. So
Hmm.
you are a part of the narrative in that sense. And this works the same way.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, to borrow from a uh, evil opponent, but Foucault's panopticon at least does can be used here, where you do think that if there can be a network of people that are all reinforcing one another's lie, and that ends up being a kind of self-policing effect, where nobody in this panopticon actually believes the narrative. It's just a self-reinforcing um,
Yeah,
idea.
that's a great reference. What does this mean for people practically day to day? Let's talk about some of the ways in which you can live with it and in it. You've mentioned pronouns in emails at work. That would be one example.
Right, right. Uh, I would say minimally, it would be don't don't say them. Uh, Look to legal legal means to push back. I mean, and they are there. I mean, we've seen many successful cases in the U.S. already. So it's not as if we're in Soviet Russia just yet. I mean, there are plenty of instances media and legal tools that are available for people to push back, and then also to build internal networks like you and I are doing, right? Where you could get to that tipping point of people if you can just get uh, collective action or collective coordination occurring.
Yeah,
Voting, right? I mean, there are a lot of tools that that they're still there.
I think also less concretely than just pronoun signatures on emails, you've got baseline assumptions like it's always more important to be nice to people than to tell the truth. I
Mhm,
mean,
mhm.
going along with that is another way of being complicit, being taken into the fold of what the speciousness of the ideology is, because that's the main way in which it advances into people's lives, isn't it?
It is, and I think that I mean Solzhenitsyn's essay "Live Not by Lies" e explains this in such an excellent way. So folks should read that as well, where he says, "Yeah, don't give any oxygen to this stuff. If you're in board meetings and you see overt lies, like walk out of them. If you're seeing or you're reading any material that isn't reinforcing these little nudges, don't be complicit. Don't be complicit in these things, because that's the thing. It's like folks, that space of complicity, I think, is where the majority of people psychologically are in, where they go, "Well, I'm not the one. I'm not waving the the rainbow flag. I'm just quietly staying neutral in the background." But the problem is that as you're doing that, and more of these lies and more of these nudges are being rolled out, and you're passively and complicitly accepting them, that does normalize things.
Yeah.
Um,
The
yeah,
the Latin root of the word complicit is really illuminating here because it literally means to be folded into or to be woven into. So you're
mhm.
allowing your own life to be woven into, taken inside the fold of what the lie
Right, right.
is.
Mhm.
And I guess finally it seals itself around you.
Yes, yeah, yeah, and I think this also goes back to the Niemoller quote that we've mentioned, and to Arendt's banality of evil, where they're expecting this overt jump to suddenly look, it's atrocity right there at your door, and institutions and societies don't often work that way. Rather, it's this slow, um, death by paper cuts, frog in the bathtub sort of effect, where suddenly you're eventually there, but it's not a discrete jump. And
Yeah.
I think people are expecting, oh, when I see the discrete jump, that's when I'll spring into action, and then I'll stand up and be part of some sort of resistance movement. But it's never like that. It's seldom is it like that. It's rather it's a slow incrementalist slide.
Yeah. Victor Klemperer, in his book on the language of the Third Reich, talks about language working like arsenic, micro doses of poison that
Mm,
slowly accumulate. And then you reach the threshold, but you haven't noticed along the way that you're getting there.
right, right. Yeah, yeah. I think that very much is the phenomenon that we need to watch out for. Uh,
We've got
yeah,
a question here. Havel says that there is little to gain from climbing current corrupt institutions. The system will just spit you out when you show your true colors. So, do we just need to learn to live outside them?
yeah. I found that to be pretty much the case. I page 27, I think, is where he talks about that. Uh, yeah, the individual will be ejected by the power structure like a foreign organism, or he or she will be compelled to be compelled to sound familiar, Will? To be compelled, or will be compelled to resign his or her individuality gradually, once again blending with the automatism and becoming its servant. Yeah, yeah, it's starting to look like you need new parallel institutions, ground up vanguardism on various fronts. It's if the institution is fully taken over, if the momentum is such that you're being pinned underneath it, uh, trying to sidestep it and start something new in the cracks might be better than trying to fight within it. You
and
probably need both.
yeah, and remembering that Havel also points out that even the people who stay within it and make it to the top, they are also its slaves. So you're not missing
Hmm.
out on a happy ever after from staying within them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, section 5 then, back to the greengrocer. There's this concept of the sign being above all about loyalty. He
Hmm.
declares his loyalty in the only way the regime is capable of hearing. That is, by accepting the prescribed ritual, by
Hmm.
accepting appearances as reality, by accepting the given rules of the game. We talked a bit about the appearances with Plato's cave, but this concept of ritual being the only language that the regime can understand is a really interesting one.
Yeah.
Why is it ritualized?
It's ritualized because this is the social proxy by which people can signal that they're down with the game, and they know their place and they know their role within the game. And ritual, it ends up becoming, I think the proxy ends up overtaking the reality underneath it. So it almost becomes like a Tower of Babel sort of scenario where the the ritual, the network of rituals, takes on a significance that is more causal. It's more causally, powerfully, socially than the world underneath, and that's the metaphysical glue that Havel keeps referring to, that holds and hems in persons within this entire structure from top to bottom.
Yeah, that's well put. I think that ultimately is how it works. It becomes more real than reality itself. And the idea of hemming in the individual is that once you start to step on that field, once you play the game, you're making it possible for the game to go on, for it to
Hmm.
exist in the first place. Now, this is someone who is going along to get along, the person we were talking about before. So he might think on the inside that he doesn't believe it. And yet, by playing it, by allowing the ball to be passed him, passing it back, observing the rules, he's contributing to the existence of the game itself.
Hmm. Certainly, and I think the other thing what the reliance on these rituals does, it does provide persons a somewhat short term promise of what a certain and reliable future is going to look like. So the greengrocer who does put up the sign, he's at least telling himself, if I keep doing this, then I'm not going to be bothered. But if I do it, it really is this existential leap into radical uncertainty. Who knows what's going to happen, right? And so now it's a question of predictive claims about uncertainty and his own imagination as to what might follow on the other side of that existential act, whereas the one who remains complicit and in place tells himself, I think ultimately, the false narrative that as long as I'm left alone, things will be calm and cool from here on out. And history tends to show that those folks don't end up doing well anyways. Maybe in the
Yeah,
short term, in the long run, yeah, they all die terribly, but as cowards.
yeah, that's it.
So
The
no.
um the immediate attraction of playing the game though is that you can score, you can get
Mhm.
praise for your skills for following the rules, you can get a gold award for doing various things, and it can feel good to be a part of it. I think that's one of the
Mhm.
main seductions.
You can ascend the hierarchy too if you play it well.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Now, the point you made earlier about the importance of ritual leading ultimately to the disengagement from reality is one that Havel stresses.
Mhm.
As the interpretation of reality by the power structure ideology is always subordinated ultimately to the interests of the structure, a system of ritual signs that replace reality with pseudo reality. I guess we can see this most clearly today in the phenomenon of nominalism, which you have written about in various articles, and
Mhm.
again is something that has come into public consciousness most powerfully with the debate about transgenderism. Now, a sign that replaces reality with pseudo reality, that's a pretty
Mhm.
close definition of nominalism, isn't it?
Yes, yeah, yeah. A fracturing of infinite names that don't grip any universal category. And yeah, we see that, yeah, going back to Occam and down through the ages now. So now we're at a point where almost everybody can uh, pick their own personal language and define reality by their own authorship.
And the various genders you can pick from. Who knows how many there are now? Well over 100.
I mean, in principle,
They are the
they're
best
supposed to be
example of
infinite.
this.
Yeah,
Yeah, exactly, potentially infinite. So
yeah.
they're a really clear example of this, and it becomes so highly ritualized that they can barely keep up with themselves.
Hmm, hmm. Yeah, yeah. The rules, the the rules of how the ritual signs are supposed to interact and play with one another. They can't even keep track of what those rules are. Yeah.
Which is a great way to test allegiance as well, because the
Right,
harder it
right.
is, the harder people have to work to do it, and the greater the commitment, loyalty they have to show.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. I hadn't thought about that. But yeah, it is a screening process for loyalty.
Yeah,
Oh,
exactly.
Matt, this is rule number 580. Oh, okay. That's self-evident. Sure. I've always believed that. That's so intuitive.
That the relationship between power and ideology starts to change because of this ritual. And Havel remarks that reality does not shape theory, but rather the reverse. Thus, power gradually draws closer to ideology than it does to reality. It draws its strength from theory and becomes entirely dependent on it. Now, let's see if we can unpack this and give some examples of it from what we see around us today. Power draws closer to ideology than it does to reality. What does he mean by this?
Well, I guess we look at it. I mean, we'll look at the instance of doctors that are willing to say that men can't get pregnant, or academics, or media, or politicians, or leaders, or clergymen that are willing to say true things, both objectively true and internally coherent. Uh, for whatever reason, I mean, this. I think this is correct. I don't know why this works though. I don't know why power does seem to draw more towards ideology and not towards reality. Um, I don't know why that is. Other than we're in a fallen world and we're using in fallen, imprecise maps. But yeah, the system will reward people that are saying things that are in a line with the ideology of falsehoods, and those who speak the truth or say things that are closer to reality are shoved to the margins.
I guess it must be partly to do with how Havel defines power and looking at his remarks about how modern consumerist society contains within itself the seeds of totalitarian bureaucracies. I would guess it's something to do with money ultimately. The Bible warns that all things obey money, and that's a tendency that we have to always guard against. It's a way in which a powerful oligarch can corrupt democracy, for example.
Hmm,
So,
hmm.
my hunch would be that the reason this happens is that ultimately it's about people saying what they have to say to keep their jobs within a system that's driven by funding that's woke, etc.
Hmm, hmm. Right. Yeah. And yeah, getting back to letting ritual signs be the things that move us as opposed to truth. I mean, yeah, the currency and money end up being the most fundamental of ritual signs that we can think back to. or some of which, language
Yeah.
itself, obviously. But
And the other point is that this is an ideology that from the outset uh, disregards the concept of objective truth. We mentioned last lesson about Nietzsche's idea that there's no facts, only interpretations, and that leaves you with vying power narratives. And truth, as they see it, really is just who can win over the most people to their
Mhm,
particular narrative. So,
mhm.
this is what that looks like.
Yes, yeah, yeah, good point.
Now, becoming entirely dependent on theory is explained by Havel in terms of this concept of continuity. If ideology is the principal guarantee of the inner consistency of power, succession is only possible against the backdrop and within the framework of a common ritual. Now, you had some remarks earlier about internal incoherence, and we also mentioned inner consistency as not necessarily being a guarantee, a criterion of truth, because the madman's psychotic delusions can be internally coherent.
Yeah,
And I
yeah.
guess that's what Havel is hinting at here. We can have an internally consistent system, and for somebody to take up the reins of power, be it next prime minister, for example, or next CEO, or next dean
Mhm.
of studies, they have to show that they're willing to work within that.
Yes, yes, certainly. The and this takes the form, yeah, of all of the ritualistic hand washing and the genuflecting before the woke shibboleths of the present day. But one might even say that it goes back further insofar as that it's not just a genuflecting to wokeism within the next 5 years, but a genuflecting to like liberal Whiggism over the last whatever 200 plus years, where it's each group or figurehead of a group takes the baton as the new leader in service of this narrative of moral progress and of progress as such, and that narrative or that ideology is never questioned, and unless you have something like natural law, there's really no competing paradigm.
Yeah, it's, the baton is a good image for it because it's like in the Olympics when the flaming torch gets passed on. The idea is that you are now the person who is going to light the way to the bright, shining, golden society of the
Hmm.
future.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good way to
Yep.
think of it. Paradoxically, though, because of the dictatorship of the ritual, however, power
Hmm.
becomes clearly anonymous. Individuals are almost dissolved in the ritual. So, this is an interesting fate, isn't it? Being dissolved in the ritual. What does he mean by this? And think about why the individual was, first of all, tempted by this in the first place. Havel says that ideology offers a kind of easy integrity. It makes people feel whole and part of something. Now, isn't this giving them what they wanted? Being dissolved in the ritual?
It doesn't. It doesn't. I guess right. The yeah. This gets back to his point that the greengrocer and the prime minister they're equally entrapped in the ideology. And what came to mind when you're um, reading that quote is Justin Trudeau. You look at Justin Trudeau, who is ostensibly, the leader of Canada, but he sounds like a one of those dolls you pull the string and it just speaks whatever 8 different pre-recorded uh, lines. So I mean, while he is supposed the figurehead is supposed to be having a lot of power, it's only he has power insofar as it's in service of this grand ideology that is overtaken him.
Mm. Havel's point earlier about the coincidence of personal power and the direction of the system, isn't it? That's a nice image of the puppet.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
the point about how the grosser contributes to the panorama as both a victim of the system and its instrument is a really important
Hmm.
one. We mentioned
Hmm. Hmm.
before about how acting as if it's true presents to other people the image that it is true. And
Yeah.
that's bad for you because it's strengthening the thing around you that is making you suffer. And you are also inflicting it on other people as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're inflicting on yourself. Yeah. That one can at the same time be a victim and the jailer of their own self.
Yeah, which is when he talks about how the people right at the top are also enslaved, you
Hmm.
see how that works because the concept of it being captive to its own lies also applies to the people within it. Because if you deviate from them, especially once you are at the top, then that means instant rejection. So,
Hmm.
whatever it is that you have to say next, you have to say. Otherwise, there's no
Yeah.
place for you within it. And the more public you are, the more important you are to the panorama, the more
Yeah.
important that becomes.
I was actually think that the prime minister might actually be more entrenched. He might the greengrocer might be more free than the prime minister
Yeah,
because there's actually less at stake.
yeah,
Being the greengrocer, he's less entrenched in this establishment.
yeah, exactly. Hubble doesn't make that point, but I think you're right because when he talks here about the grocer having very little power, the trade off for the greater power of the prime minister
Mm-hmm.
is becoming more involved and therefore more complicit, more woven into the fold of it.
Yeah. Yep. Definitely. Yeah.
This was an interesting distinction he drew between the classical and bureaucratic dictatorships because he points out that crucially in the classical dictatorship, the line of conflict can still be drawn according to social class. There's
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
the ruling group, and then there is us, and we can clearly see they're imposing power on us. But in the post totalitarian system, this line runs de facto through each person. For everyone, in his own way, is both a
Mm-hmm.
victim and a supporter of the system. Now, that concept seems at first glance not to make any sense. How can you be both a victim and a supporter? But to recap on what we've covered so far, how would you explain it?
I mean, this reminded me right away of Solzhenitsyn, of the line that draws down the middle of each person, and at each moment, at every decision that we make, uh, every attitude that we take, everything that we say to ourselves internally, everything that we imagine in terms of what our future actions will generate, that can be we can end up being prisoners of our own imaginations and our own self choosing, uh, by granting legitimacy and strength to this perceived network of ideological commitments and the consequences they that are assumed to connect to them.
Yeah, that's it. Questions come in saying dissolving individuality removes responsibility and accountability too. Interesting how this
Hmm.
occurs naturally according to Havel. Although, here, when he's saying that you are a supporter of the system, it might feel like you are excusing yourself, but actually, that is a result of a choice to comply, a choice to be complicit. So I'm not convinced it would entirely dissolve individual responsibility because he's saying that the system depends on individuals creating and sustaining it. But you definitely get the excuse, you get the illusion that you had no choice.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
So degeneracy is one of my favorite words. And here we get from Havel the most extreme form of it, because not only does the system alienate humanity, but at the same time, alienated humanity supports this system as its own involuntary master plan, as a degenerate image of its own degeneration, as a record of people's own failure as individuals. Now, how can it function as a degenerate image of our own degeneration? That question saying that it dissolves individual responsibility and accountability. I don't think Havel would agree, looking at his remarks here. It's a reminder of our own failure as individuals.
Yeah, I mean, you've mentioned it last time that courage can be contagious and cowardice can be contagious. So in that same way, I think that when we see degenerate images or degenerate instances of our own moral failings, if that iterates across an entire group of people, then it's like everyone's looking for some exemplar to stand up, and if it's not there, then degeneration quickens.
Yeah, and what you see around you is basically the embodiment of emasculation, and
Mhm, mhm.
that's a crushing realization that collectively people have failed, and it makes you think that what could you do differently?
Yep. Yeah. And then I think once again we run into this collective action problem where it's the guys on the flight watching the jihadi waving the box cutter, thinking, well, as soon as somebody else, one, two, three people jump up and rush him, then I'll jump in, or but I'm not going to be the first guy that makes. I'm going to get cut. So everybody's frozen in this collective action problem, where no one wants to be the first mover, and
Mm.
as a result, nobody moves. Even though if conditionally, if only a few moved, then everybody would move, and everybody would likely be safe.
Yeah, you need to meet a threshold, and that's why, just as the ideology is ultimately imposed initially by a revolutionary elite, the counter revolutionary elite is also required, if for no other reason than to provide that exemplar.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that's the classic definition of leadership. Yeah, it
Yeah.
requires that first movers leading by example.
Now, we mentioned last lesson Havel's concept of the convex mirror, so like a magnifying glass. And he believes that totalitarian systems simply put a magnifying glass over the latent tendencies, the hidden tendencies of modern society. And these are his four reasons. There's a question earlier in the chat saying that is this ultimately about people getting what they want, or at least what they deserve? And it's the fault of ourselves that this kind of thing is even possible. So Havel says the post-totalitarian system has been built on foundations laid by the historical encounter between dictatorship and a consumer society. Four reasons. We're too consumption oriented. And what this means is that we will not sacrifice any kind of material luxury for spiritual or moral values,
Mhm.
for our own spiritual and moral integrity. We're also too quick to surrender higher values when faced with the trivializing temptations of modern civilization. We also display vulnerability to the attractions of mass indifference. And lastly, the greyness and the emptiness of life in the post totalitarian system is only an insulated caricature of modern life in general. Now, looking at those four features, I think they're even more prevalent now in contemporary society than they were when Havel first wrote the essay.
Oh, certainly, yeah. With the internet and smartphones and social media and the vast set of superficial distractions and stimulation and titillation that people have as a surrogate for real meaning or real value. I think it's gotten considerably worse. This consumptive society that he has pointed out.
What's interesting then about what he's saying here is that what he's describing is ultimately more of a symptom than a cause. So, this is what the premises of modern society naturally tend towards. Once you've accepted this environment where all that matters is money and consumer goods, once you've hollowed out life of the sacred and you're left with grayness and emptiness, then
Mhm.
you're going to want some kind of easy answer. You've created a hole for ideology to
Mhm.
fill. And if you can be easily tempted with trivialities, if you're prone to mass indifference, then who's going to really care about trying to live within the truth? That can be painful. It sounds like it'd be tough to me. I mean, I lost my house over this stuff, and most people, given the choice, just wouldn't want to do that.
Yeah, I think so. I think that is that's the trade-off. But I think that's always been the trade-off. I don't think. I mean, the the surface structure of the problem might be different for our generation, but I think for all of humanity, it's been that trade-off of orienting towards something transcendent and not of this world, or orienting towards comfort and ease of the humanly world. I just think this is just probably the next iteration of it.
Yeah, although ultimately, what you think is the path of comfort ends up being terrible.
The road
So,
to perdition. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. So, the informants in Soviet Russia, for example, they still went off to the gulag.
Hmm. Hmm. Yep. Yeah. So yeah, this is my earlier point. Yeah, that the complicit greengrocer who thinks that complicity is going to just it's going to be his best bet in preserving his comfort. It's just he's just not looking at things on a long enough timeline, or a timeline that's not historically informed.
Yeah, that's it. And the point that Havel makes at the end is that ultimately what we have here is a warning to the West revealing its own latent tendencies, because the concept that liberalism presents of what a human being is and what society is, it contains the seeds of totalitarianism within itself. So some questions here are relevant to that. Is inspiring critique of the ritual our main goal? What would you say in response to that? Critique of the ritual should be the top priority.
I think that's part and parcel of the how Havel's state of affairs ended up and how we're in this present state of affairs. But I think mere critiquing of the ritual isn't going to unbind the metaphysical glue of the system that he's talking about. I think there you need, as we've talked about this in other conversations, I think a reimagining or return of the a proper Aristotomist view of the human person as not being a atomized Lockean individual, but rather being a familial and a social, irreducibly social metaphysical entity. I mean, if you have a flawed anthropology of man or a flawed metaphysics of man, then all of your views of what the individual or the collective good are going to look like they're going to be skewed. So I think that, to my mind, is a more proper fulcrum point to focus on, as opposed to like let's just critique the the token rituals of the present day. I mean, both are important, but I think in terms of priority, a proper metaphysics of man is a better starting point than mere criticism of social ritual.
Yeah, exactly. I would put that in terms of, rather than trying to treat the symptoms of the disease, try to strengthen your immune system. How come you got sick in the first place?
Mhm,
And
mhm.
those
Right,
four
right.
features that Hubble was talking about earlier, to use an analogy, that might be, well, why are you only sleeping a couple of hours a night? Why did you no exercise? Why do you eat junk?
Mhm. Yep,
Because
yep.
ultimately, that's the picture he's painting of what modern society is and why it
Mhm,
gets
mhm.
infected with this in the first place. So it's really
Yeah.
about the starting points for what a man is, what's a family, what's a state,
Mhm.
etc. Those are all
Yep,
wrong from the beginning. But the
yep.
the tragedy of it is that, as even Schopenhauer put it, man is the animum metaphysicum, the metaphysical animal. You're always going to get the metaphysics. You talked about the metaphysical glue. It's just whether it's going to be true or false. So you're going to
Yeah.
get some kind of
Some
religious
kind of
system,
yes,
and
yes.
you better make sure it's the right one.
So, yeah, I agree. The other thing too that keeps coming up in my mind is what ought to be the appropriate metaphysics and ethics in relation to technology, because one might just look at all of this as downstream from the industrial and informational paradigms that we've been inhabiting and reinforcing. So it's like, would a return to agrarianism and to some version of some semi-Luddism, would that uh, help all these four symptoms that Havel talks about? Wouldn't a lot of that just go away if we were in some Amish community, one might argue?
Yeah, I think that would work well with the idea that they have a kind of armor against it, which means that they have no weak points for it to enter into. So it's not so much the fact that they haven't got technology, it's more about what is it about their values, which means that isn't recognized as a loss.
Yeah, yeah. So maybe the values come first, and then the technological means or rejection of certain technological means come second.
Yeah, we need to return to that thought, I think, again and again with quite a few of the books we're looking at, because
Hmm.
it's one of the defining features of not just our age, but also one of the main tactics that gives the manipulatory network hitherto unknown reach. I don't think any system like Havel is describing here, although they've existed many times before in history, has ever had quite the same range of tools at its disposal.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. That's very true.
All right, we covered a lot today. Pleased with how that went. Lots of interesting concepts for people to mull over, particularly that final point about technology. So we'll be finishing Havel next week and doing a recap of what we think we need to take from this to apply to subsequent books. And I'd recommend in the meantime that everybody starts reading Edward Fraser's The Last Superstition. And we'll be
Hmm.
devoting at least 4 weeks to going through the main concepts in that.
Yep, sounds
All right.
good.
Excellent. It's been a pleasure. Speak with you next week.
Same here. Thanks, everybody.
Take care.